Hey everyone, once again, this is another episode of the Business of Education. My name is Kyle Wallgren, and today I have an exciting guest, the founder of a company called ETCH. I brought him on for more of my selfish desires because I wanted to learn a lot about the EdTech markets, and this guy's been paving the way. He founded ETCH, like I said, which is dedicated to providing information in the EdTech space, job posting, venture markets, and everything else. Matt, thanks for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Kyle. I'm excited to dig in.
Matt, I was given an introduction with a little bit of your background, and I just felt like there was so much that I could learn personally from what you've done with Etch. But why don't you tell us a little bit about Etch, just so our viewers know what it is?
Sure. So at base level, ETCH provides news and information about the edtech market. So it came from a problem I saw. I was in past lives had been a startup person. I worked in biz dev at an early boot camp, and then worked for one of the big publishers. And for the past 4 or 5 years, had been a VC. And one of the problems that I ran into was there was a lot of opacity around what was going on in the market. And there were some good resources. You know, there are good companies like EdSurge and Inside Higher Ed and the Chronicle of Higher Education, and there's probably a dozen sources that I use today that I think are great, but no one who is synthesizing it with a business lens. And so I started it as a side hustle. We were bored during COVID and I needed something to do on the weekends. So I started sending an email to about 20 friends and got enough sort of positive reinforcement that I kept doing it. And eventually it had grown to the point and the growth rate was interesting enough that I said, well, why not try and make this a business? Newsletters are not exactly a venture market. I'm not about to raise $20 million for my EdTech focused newsletter, but it was something that I really enjoyed doing. And it seemed like other people appreciated. And that like combination was like, all right, that's enough for me to try this.
Was your experience in the venture space EdTech? Like, what brought you to be passionate about the EdTech space?
Yeah. So my career up to that point had been all focused on EdTech. Not super intentionally. I was an entrepreneur in college and not like a super effective one. So the boot camp I took was how to do business. It was more sophisticated than that, but that was honestly like my mindset going into it. And they did a great job. And I was like, more people from liberal arts colleges like mine should do this. So I went and worked for them. And then as they were, shutting down because they couldn't quite make it work as a business, a mentor helped me get a job at another ed tech company, a big publisher. And, then I got the VC job and all of a sudden it's like, well, I've been in this market for 10 years. I like that I can have a pretty reasonable salary. Like I can have a nice, house and family on my salary and also feel like I'm doing something impactful in the world. Like, I sleep really well at night. Like I feel like I'm working on the right things. It's really fun.
That's probably my favorite part about it is that I do sleep really well knowing that what I'm working on is bigger than myself.
Yeah.
Because for the first half of my life, I felt like I lived probably for myself and really nobody else out there. And then all of a sudden I was blessed with kids. I'm a father of four now. So like getting to watch them grow, but like going through COVID, I just was when I pivoted in. I was never in education. I was just in business. I actually owned a manufacturing company when COVID hit. And it just seeing what was going on and seeing how many people suffered from literacy issues like myself just really made me want to focus. Like, hey, this is going to need a lot of attention to really help build this out so people can get better at it. So I got introduced to you by asking questions around Baiju and other ed tech companies. We've seen the space change. You said you're from the venture space. I, I'm raising money for my ed tech company now. It's one of the hardest things I've ever done. Why do you think it's so hard? I feel like it's so much harder to raise money in ed tech than maybe most other spaces. Why do you think that is?
Yeah. And I was talking with Alex Sarlin the other day, from the EdTech Insiders gang, and sort of fleshing out a thesis around this. And it's still not perfect, but I feel like I'm getting closer, which is, you know, much of, not all of, but much of EdTech is really is like a recipient of policy decisions, and with some limited ability to affect those decisions, right, and to set the course for their businesses. But largely, it's companies are reacting to the policy decisions at the federal and national level and trying to be compliant with the standards that are getting set both by like literal government entities and quasi-government entities, and that makes it complicated to participate in the business, right? It's every sale is going through, not every sale, but many sales are going through government RFPs, and like, so there's a whole compliance aspect to it that makes it, frankly, a better fit for managed services than technology. The way that we think of, like, if you think of Slack's origin story, it's like, you and I can start a Slack channel today, and it costs us nothing. And, you know, we can invite a bunch of people, and all of a sudden we have a Slack channel with a bunch of people on it. No one's ever really going to question that. You know, they'll question whether they should be a part of it or not, but they're not going to question its existence.
Right.
Whereas, you know, even companies like Remind, which built the market for teachers communicating with parents, something that, like, I think it's fair to say is like a pretty just like good thing to have, like a communication channel between teachers and parents.
Right.
But even that had to go through, you know, they did product led growth, but even that, like, they had to eventually get compliant and, like, you know, make sure that the schools had sanctioned the teacher's ability to use the Remind channel to talk with parents. And, you know, the administrators were saying, well, why can't you use email? Why can't you use this official channel? So it's just like, there's this whole regulatory apparatus that in many ways is good. Like, there are a lot of really good, important things that come from it. And, like, you know, when you're dealing with a kid's education, just like when you're dealing with somebody's health, like, you have to be careful not to get things wrong. It's really bad when you get that wrong, and it has a long-term impact. But it's also really complicated. And, like, the whole venture model is built around 5-year exits and, you know, getting to $100 million in revenue in 5 years. And the two are, it's really hard to build a business that is simpatico with both those objectives.
What, with you being in the venture space and now focusing on ed tech, what are some companies that have really done well from your research, scaling through that journey that you've got to witness?
Yeah. So I think another thing that I've gotten smarter about, I think this has always existed, but it's one of those, like, the more experience you get, the more you realize the way things are. You know, one tried and true path to growing a reasonably large ed tech company is following policy decisions and saying, you know, hey, when the United Kingdom instituted a tax levy to create apprenticeship opportunities that said, I forget, I think it's like 1 or 2% of revenues from every company in the UK has to be allocated. Doesn't have to be spent, but has to be allocated to apprenticeships at that company. Once they're over a certain size, like, there's more rules to it.
Right.
Just bear with me. That's an obvious market opportunity. Like, every company has to do this by law. Like, feels like a pretty good space to build a company in. And that's how you get multiverse. In the US, you know, it was like 2014, we more formally sort of instituted the 5250 tuition assistance policy that said, like, you know, it's a tax benefit. And, you know, Guild was started like that year or like months later. During COVID, you know, we had a bunch of ESSER funding for tutoring. You know, of course, like, you see a bunch of tutoring companies spring out of that. So, you know, I think that's definitely one way to build edtech companies. And it's as we're seeing in the OPM space, you know, the policy giveth and the policy taketh, of, like, you know, when the policy changes, like, you might be up a creek. But, you know, that's certainly one strategy. And then the other approach is to just avoid the regulatory apparatus entirely, which is what companies like Duolingo have done. Then they've just said, look, you know, you can use us. You and I can sign up for us, and they actually have done efficacy studies to prove their sort of similar or greater quality to many language learning apps done via schools and other things. But they said it's not worth. We don't want to build a business that's dependent on the regulatory apparatus.
No, that makes sense. I've actually never took a step back and looked at it. But now, as you're saying this, I'm like, yeah, that follows so much stuff that we look at. And right now, because there's such a huge view on reading levels in the United States, it's been like an open checkbook for reading companies.
Yep.
I think there was a few things that happened in that space. You mentioned COVID and ESSER funding. A lot of companies were founded off the idea of ESSER funding, and now that it's being pulled away, you're seeing a lot of resources being pulled out of the class, and a lot of those companies I don't think are going to be able to continue on or even access more capital because that category is kind of fallen by the wayside. It was misappropriated in my opinion, but that's a topic for another day. The big thing though is that a lot of people rush to the markets to build a product for that solution individually at home learning. And then we all went back to what is close to normal as we can. What are some of the things that you've seen during COVID become trends or ways that people are operating that disappeared really quick?
It's a good question. And, I think sort of also calling back to the previous question of, I think the entrepreneurs that are super intentional are the ones that do the best, right?
Right.
So, to your point, we went from literally every student, all 50 million K-12 students online, roughly, down to, now we have 4 million who are in alternative schooling environments. And that's actually like a pretty substantial increase from the 2.5 that were, being homeschooled or micro-schooled pre-COVID.
Right.
So like, actually that market has grown if you have the right perspective. And I think it's the founders who have said like, we are building very intentionally for the micro school market. And like, we're going to ignore the noise around COVID and just say like, what do we think the demographics are going to be at steady state rather than what the demographics were in like January 2021.
Right.
Right. Or they're saying, yeah, public school buyers are going to come back. Like, it's going to be fine. We still have whatever it is, 46 million public school students. Like, we'll stick with that market. So, I think that's the one that people talk about a lot. I think it's the entrepreneurs who are intentional about it and don't try to like straddle a bunch of different worlds are the ones who have sort of had the most success.
Do you think the coupon programs or whatever you want to call them that states are rolling out where they can allocate their school funding to homeschools or private schools is going to increase that homeschool market?
I don't know. I think that is the most interesting question in all of education right now because it is a fundamentally different financial model for everybody involved.
Right.
And the way that I think about it is you built the public school infrastructure in the US around, a school has 100 kids and each kid gets $10,000 of funding. Like, pick a number, it doesn't matter.
Right.
And there were a couple of reports I think this week talking about average spend.
10,000 is pretty close
in the US. Yeah. So just for easy math, it's like 100 students times $10,000 of students. Okay, we have that amount of revenue to like build literal schools, right? And like the whole school, like many towns issue bonds to get the construction done, and like the whole thing is predicated on there being 100 students, and like your payback period over 30, 50 years of that structure. And even when you take away 5-10 students, the whole thing has the potential to unravel, right? And so there's this like, arguably individual students will be better off being able to decide what the best option for them is. I think that's like a pretty reasonable argument to make, actually.
For sure.
It forces each player involved to work harder to both recruit and retain that student, which I think is a good thing. But the public system really quickly becomes shaky. And so I think that's the battle that hasn't yet played out in the US system. but is rapidly approaching as we see the adoption of more vouchers and education savings accounts options across the
My
states.
little town's going through that in real time. When COVID hit, well, I'm Texas based, so everybody in the country either
Yep.
moved to Texas or Florida, right? Or at least it felt
Yeah.
like it. So our little town grew from, and these aren't exact numbers, but I bet you it increased by 20% in less than 2 years. And the year everybody went back to school, they were bringing in mobiles to house all these kids, and then as quick as it was built up, they pulled their kids into homeschool. Like homeschooling around here is growing so fast. So like we built a bond, or they put the bond out based off what that growth was year one to build this new facility. And then year two, after it was approved, a chunk of those kids were pulled out to go to start homeschooling. So I really just, you helped me understand that for the first time. I've never thought about that and how it worked, but I guess I've never asked that question on how that stuff
Yeah.
worked.
I mean, it really is a question of like, how is your town going to pay for that facility without the same number of kids? And so like each individual choice may make sense for that student. And like, I don't begrudge anybody for choosing the option they think is best for their child. But like when you start to look at the macro implications, it starts to get, potentially scary. And who knows, like maybe this is me crying wolf, like, it'll be okay. And, there's a lot of people who have a vested interest in figuring out a path to some solution. But it's a huge change. I cannot understate how big a change it is when you change the core financial model of 50 million students' education.
No, for sure. And I think like my wife's one of those people that are on the fence. We moved our oldest son from public school to private school, and I warned her in advance. I'm like, God, this isn't going to be any different or any better. You're just now going to pay for it, and they have to wear uniforms. Like that's ultimately what the difference is going to be. And a year into that, she's like, I think I just want to homeschool. This wasn't what I thought it was going to be. But I think that, do you think that all the media around content within the classroom and teachers' opinion drove homeschool? What do you think that marker was all of a sudden that homeschool just started to accelerate growth?
I don't know. I think, well, so I guess very viscerally, it was seeing their child on a laptop during COVID and being
Right.
like, oh, you're not actually learning 8 hours a day. I think, and actually, I listened to your episode with Jessica Millstone, and I thought she put it really, really well.
Jessica's amazing.
Yeah, she's super, super smart. I recommend anybody listening to this also listen to that one. But she's like, really the academics is one of the functions that schools play in the U.S. and in other countries, but really it's childcare. And it's like, it allows you and I to like work for 8 hours. The fact that our kids are gone,
right?
For, at least 6, if not more. And I think like that, people haven't really figured out how to reconcile that, because like homeschooling, there's all those stories of like, yeah, my kid spends 2 hours a day learning and like meets standards, and then he's like out in the yard playing and like being in nature, which honestly sounds kind of great.
100%. So I wasn't taken out of school. I got in trouble at school a lot, so I would get sent home from school on short-term punishments, suspensions, and stuff. But my parents would make me go to work. They thought that was the punishment. You got kicked out of school, you're going to go to work and work all day, and that was your punishment. But I learned like so much hands-on stuff during those times, like going out and work, because I was just, roasted about go do this, go clean that, wash this. And when I think back to some of the things that made me who I was today, successful in my business career, was like those moments where I wasn't at school, learning from a trade. And then the other thing that my school had, which is kind of falling by the wayside, was it was called the RAP program, the Registered Apprenticeship Program. So you went to school for the first 3 hours in the morning, and then the 3 hours in the afternoon, you went and worked for a company. And it seems like that's, not as popular, or schools are doing away with that type of thing in real time. So it's interesting that you point that out and how we need to handle that. I think that life skills is super important anymore, and we're not even teaching that. Like when I went to school, we also had like home economics and shop, and those are things that are all now being cut out of the budgets.
Yeah, and like, there are actually a bunch of investors who would like apprenticeships to be a thing, and like me too, to at least some extent. Of like, I think the earlier you can get work experience, the better. I mowed lawns, I painted houses, I
Mhm.
tended bar, like I did taught skiing and snowboarding, like I did every sort of entry level job, like service job you could imagine, and I think it was great for me. Um, I think it's trying to figure out like how much tracking, and I mean like not like tracking, sort of tracking results, but like how much do you like, if I make the choice to go into vocational tech, like that's a choice, right? And like, am I at 16 equipped to make that choice? And I think that's like the tricky thing, because there's no answer, right? Because like, arguably, everybody loves to bring up welders. I think welders are actually like sort of a bad example because they actually have a lower expected salary than what all the politicians would like you to believe.
Right.
But it's like, the path to making 80 or $100,000 is much clearer if you're willing to be an electrician than it is if you want to be like a knowledge worker, whatever the heck that means, right?
Right.
Like, at EdSoma, like I'm sure you have folks who are entry level who are below that, and like they could grow to be executives and make far
Hmm.
more than that. But like that path is not linear. That path is not super clear. Like it comes in fits and starts. It's just really hard to like talk to people about. So I don't know. It just gets really tricky.
The thing where Congress confuses that is that they leave out a very important part that, and everybody's entitled to their own opinion, but where they say welders make all this money is it was like oil field welders that would leave their families and go to work on these jobs in the middle of nowhere.
Right.
That,
Well, and there's like 600 oil field welders in the country.
right.
Like I looked at, it's on the BLS. Like there's less than 1,000 in the entire country. So it's like, cool, you found, one of 600 oil field welders in a workforce of 100 million people.
Right. And that, you mentioned it earlier, was like when the government changes its mind, that industry changes as well. That was what
Mm-hmm.
I grew up in the oil field. I grew up in Alberta, Canada. You either played hockey or worked in the oil field. Like that was
Yeah,
that was what there was to
that's
do.
real.
And when in 2015 I saw policy changes take place that took oil from $125 a barrel to negative $15 a barrel.
I remember
And
this. Matt Levine wrote a great thing about that.
all of my friends, like a lot of businesses, everything just kind of fell apart. And at that moment, I was like, I never want to be involved in another business that can disappear in a moment based off of how a certain party believes it should be. You know what I mean? Like, and it just scared the crap out of me. So I got out of it. 2015 was the last time I played in the oil field, but I was third generation. And then I guess I
I
dived
mean,
into.
that was a really good year to get out. My undergraduate thesis was about the economics of oil, and like that was like literally the peak, and it's been downhill from there, basically.
Yeah. So I
A
caught
little bit better in the past couple of years.
I caught the, I wish I would have got out like even 6 months earlier, but like I caught the bottom of it. What sent us out is my biggest client went bankrupt for over $4.5 million. And I ended up selling all the company assets to pay off the debt and moved on. It was like, okay, now what? You know what I mean? So then that's actually when I started getting ready to move to the US. And that was another whole journey. And then I got into entertainment and live venue space. COVID kicked the crap out of that. And then I got into manufacturing. So I kind of got like a few kick in the knees, one after another, which built up some resilience because the resilience is what I've needed to be in the ed tech space, especially raising money, because you do hear the word no a lot when talking to VCs. For some of our young listeners in the ed tech space going into raising capital, what are some things, that they need to really identify before going in and taking that shot? What are some recommendations you'd have?
Yeah. Well, so the first recommendation is like get at least three pieces of advice. Because like it's hard to what works for one person is not going to work for everybody else.
Right.
I gave this advice when I was painting houses too. I was like, get three quotes, probably don't take the lowest one, and then, think about whether you want the highest or the middle one, decide who feels like an easier person to work with, and that's generally the right move for contractors.
Mm-hmm.
But for raising money, I think like the things that I would stand by are, one, treat it like a sales process. So like make your list of investors just like you make your list of clients, and run them through a pipeline the same way you do, with your normal go-to-market motion. And I think that helps you like disassociate the process, because like when an investor says no, it's not personal. It's
Right.
very rarely personal. So I think like do what you can to make the whole process feel impersonal. And like when you find the right one, great. It doesn't take that many to build a company. You just need a couple early believers, particularly. Two, don't, especially at the early stages, inflate what you're doing. I think the pitch decks that sort of give me like heartburn are the ones that talk about being like the global leader in XYZ. I'm like, you're not. Like you have, $100,000 of revenue. You're just not the global leader. I promise you. No matter what you're doing, like I feel pretty good about that statement. So like, just say like, yeah, this is the problem I want to solve. I think this is a really important problem. It's really personal to me because of X, Y, and Z. Like I care about solving it. And like, I think I have a reasonable shot at solving it. And like, oh, by the way, like the person who does solve it, like there's a really big market out there. So like, don't let your like marketing say the TAM. Like using your marketing speech to talk about TAM is always the wrong answer. Like use numbers to define your TAM.
Mm-hmm.
Talk about the actual problem you're solving. Don't like cross those two. That would probably be the other. And then the third one maybe that I would give is start writing your narrative as early as possible. Again, without like inflating it. Talk about what you're doing, and it's funny how people will start following along.
I've even taken it one step closer where we call it our EdSoma strategic target market for year one, because we want to break it down. Although we're a product that can service K through 8, we're focused on K through 4, knowing that we're going to grow into the K8 space to try and like really narrow it down. Like we understand we can't start off at the top. We can't be the business or global leader day one. We've got to start with one classroom and grow it into two.
The differences of teaching a 4th grader or a kindergartner how to read and the difference and an 8th grader, huge. Like they are just different. And it very rarely are you going to be able to serve all those different types of students in one go. And that's okay. Like you need to be able to show the path to the TAM. You don't have to say you serve it all immediately today.
Right. No, that's super helpful. One of the things that I wanted to talk to you about was your research on Baiju, who I felt was the EdTech company to be until, 6 or 8 months ago. When you were watching that whole thing, what do you think that they did really well? And then did you see something where you started asking questions and you're like, oh, this looks like a tower of cards ready to fall?
Yeah. So, I think first of all, I think the part of the story that has gotten lost with all the bad news about them is Baiju is unequivocally one of the most charismatic founders in the space. And like this dude literally filled soccer stadiums, cricket stadiums in India of people who wanted to learn from him. He was a really, really good teacher. And that's like proven, like it is not debatable. I think where, and there's like tons of evidence to back that up on YouTube, in the press, et cetera. Like, so I get why he had a lot of early backers and a lot of really smart early backers. I think what happened, and this is sort of the way that I started following it. I wrote my first article on them in June 2022, where I was like, I just don't understand like the sequencing of what's going on. And it was stuff like, I'm trying to remember, somebody wrote something like bad about them. Oh, you know what it was? It was the first article that I was like, oh, that's weird. It was they wrote about how the company used arguably pretty coercive sales tactics, and they had a sales force that was, going door to door across, India, and getting parents to sign for loans for the company's tablet and software products. And then
Right.
that had its own like little thing where the company was actually marking their tablet sales as ARR, when it's like, no, that's a device sale. Like those are two. The software is SaaS software sales, and the device is its own category of
Right.
revenue. Like you
The
can't
hardware
mix
sale.
those two, and that's actually legally what got them in hot water. 18 months later. But the coercive sales tactics were the first time I was like, oh, that's weird.
They did that same
Like I
sales tactic in America with like over telephone.
Yeah,
I know a few
yes,
people that had that same
exactly.
experience.
And it's not like it wasn't like a novel thing. I mean, if you've seen the Danny McBride thing on the customer support centers,
Mm-hmm.
that's like a whole field where a lot of people made a lot of money doing some awful sales practices.
Well, 10x sales
Um,
training does that, it teaches you that tactic, like this very aggressive car salesman type
yeah,
tactic.
and like, look, there's plenty of good salesmen out there. I don't want to just like knock sales in general, but like this was like, and if you go back and read the article, it's still up. It's on restofworld.com. Just like Google Baiju Rest of World.
Yeah, we'll make
You
sure
can
to put
see,
the links in the description of this podcast for
yeah.
anybody that wants to see
So
them.
it's like, okay, you're getting, poor people in India to sign up for loans that it's clear
Can't
they're not
afford.
going to be able to pay. I'm like, that's terrible. What was the trigger for me that like maybe something bigger is going on is pretty soon thereafter, there was a rumor about the company wanting to buy Chegg and Baiju, or Chegg and Tuyu.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, that is also like pretty strange. And 2021, the company had bought like 12 companies. And so it's like, I guess you have this like M&A apparatus, which we later found out was actually pretty phony, and like they had done a pretty terrible job integrating, but it was this like tit for tat of like bad news, good news, where I was like, because of how closely associated and how tit for tat this is, I am now skeptical. And so that was the first time I had published about this, and it soon became clear that, I mean, to be blunt about it, like they were willing to lie in the press about the company's metrics, about how they were doing, like about things that were going on, and then it would come out later via like a more reliable source. Um, Recently, it's been their investors being like, you can't just like cram us down 100% and expect us not to like say something about the shady stuff you've been doing. That it was just like, okay, like I'm out on these guys. And so
Mm-hmm.
I got more and more vociferous. In retrospect, I sort of wish I had been a little bit more like something, this is messed up, versus saying like, I think something funny's going on. Like that probably would have been better for like views or clicks or whatever, but it was hard, right? There was no inside information. It was just like, I don't know, like the timing of this just seems weird.
There was a few weird things that, and I was coming into the space new, right? So I'd never raised money. I was never in education. So I was going to like every ed tech conference I could think of to go and learn and hear from these people. And Baiju was on every stage in America.
He was at Davos.
There you go. And Baiju's wife was doing just as much stuff,
Mm-hmm.
as he was. And they were buying American companies. So those people that were selling companies were moving over to Baiju. And it was just like this media monster that they were everywhere, right? But I can't, maybe it was at ASU GSV Summit where I sat down and listened to his wife talk, and they talked about like metrics of how the company was growing and how do you know that the company's ready for an IPO. And she made this comment where I felt like it needed to be like an annual, a data driven definition of what the answer would be. And she said something, well, our users keep coming back, so we know the product's working. And I'm like, wait a minute, like 95% of your users get it for free. So how are you using this freemium metric that you're retaining customers as your growth metric. Like, it just, that was the thing that where I'm like, I need to learn more about this. And then I think they acquired like Epic right afterwards, and or maybe they had just acquired Epic and they were using those numbers into their subscribers, paid subscriber numbers, because I think Epic was maybe one of their bigger paid revenues that they purchased.
Maybe, I'm not sure. I think, the other sort of big takeaway for me that I hopefully will carry with me for the rest of my career is like the person who starts the company doesn't have to be the person who continues building it long term.
I say that all the time.
And yeah, and like, we have this sort of cult of, Steve Jobs, Mark Zuckerberg, et cetera. But even Mark Zuckerberg hired Sheryl Sandberg to like help him do the business side until he was ready, which, she was there for 15 years before he felt like he could take that on. Maybe reshaping that history a little bit. But I think that's the thing talking to founders now is like, look, you should be proud of being able to like build something from scratch. And then it's like finding the right talent to take you to the next level rather than feeling like you have to be, the CEO forever. And even you can still be the CEO, but have somebody else, building out the infrastructure of what it takes to be a really big company.
That's one of the things that I talk about all the time internally with us is like, I might be the guy that can get us to, halfway there, but, I'm learning every day and I want to continue to learn. That's why I have conversations with like people like yourself and whoever will give me 35, 40 minutes to tell me about the things that they know, is so I can continue to grow with it. But I'm never going to put the growth of our company or the opportunity of our company at risk out of selflessness decisions. And so I've been preparing myself since day one to be able to let somebody else take it over when that time's right. If it comes, hopefully it never does, but just like, because it is your baby, you put your blood, sweat, and tears into your business. And then to have, I would hate to have a board come to me and be like, hey, thanks for what you've done. It's time to go. You know what I mean? I'd rather be able to identify that in real time and be like, hey, I think it's time for somebody more experienced in this field to take this to the next level. But what were some of the things, if you were to take a look at that individual company and if you think that they could redo it again, what's something that you think they made a mistake? Was it the M&As? Like, what do you think it was?
Yeah, it was hubris, frankly. It was, and again, like I try to give as much credit for his charisma as he deserves, which is a lot, but they clearly never installed a like real executive to run the operations of the company. And when they finally did, they hired I don't remember if he was a division CFO or the actual CFO of Pepsi to come in and be their CFO, okay, after a lot of the shenanigans that happened. The guy quit in like 6 months because he's like, this is a disaster. Like, why I literally like refuse to sign off on your financial statements, especially because our auditor also quit. And like, you're not a serious person about running this company.
And that's what had the board step away. And
that was when, like, if you look at like when that guy got hired to when he left, like when he got hired, I think the board was still sort of behind him and was like, we can probably make this work. Like, hopefully the media won't figure out how bad things actually were and this guy can clean it up. And then when he left, it was like, that was when things got really nasty. Right. And you had board members quitting and that type of thing. So it was hubris. And like, it's such a, like, I give credit to the founders who are able to do this, because it's like, you have to be irrationally, you have to be an irrational believer in your company to get it to, $1 of revenue, 100,000, $1 million, 10 million, Byju's was hundreds of millions of dollars of revenue. You have to be a little bit crazy to like pull that off as a founder. But then you also have to have the self-awareness to say, I'm not cutting it anymore. Or like, I can't be the only voice here. I need to bring in some other folks to round out my skills. Like, Byju just like bought stuff and it was clear nobody ever told him no. Like, probably you should have a person who's like willing to say no to you when you're a company of that size.
Do you think that the impact that that had, watching that fall apart, is going to have a major effect in new companies raising capital in the edtech space?
Not really, because it's like so obvious what the problem was. Like it was such a founder problem, and continues to be such a founder problem. I think that the bigger issue for the space is both interest rates and the regulatory environment. To get back to our first topic of, you know, we spent a bunch of money during the COVID years and even post COVID years trying to keep education afloat. And now we're renormalizing. And, I think investors also got a little exuberant during the COVID years, and they are paying the price for that right now as valuations come back. So, unfortunately, I think we probably are going to have a couple of down years and we're not through it. I'm not going to, as much as I would like to be positive, and I'm positive about many things in the market, I think on a macro level, we've still got some muck to kind of crawl through. But I think it's just a normal market reset. And like it sucks when you're an active participant in it. Like I feel I have empathy for you and the other founders in the space, but I think it's probably pretty healthy overall. And the good companies will still figure out a way.
The and I've got a couple questions left, and then I'll let you go because I told you this would be short. But you just mentioned valuations skyrocketed during COVID and they're kind of inflated. I agree with that 100% because we're seeing, where we're at, we're raising money at maybe 50-60%, if that, of what companies in our same position raised money at, during COVID. Those companies that raised money at those big valuations, what do you think their next play is now that, they're unable to raise rounds at that same value?
I think it's hard, right? Because it's not they have so many stakeholders, especially in the later rounds,
Mm-hmm.
where it's like you have an employee option pool that if you raise a down round, you're taking your the stock that your employees are counting on, and cutting it in half. You're hurting your early investors, who are your early believers, like the people who are like, you can do this, and you're having to have this really uncomfortable conversation where it's like either they're taking I said cram down earlier, it's like you're resetting the valuation at a much lower point.
Right.
So it's like either you're diluting them or you're diluting yourself, or both, and some other new person is coming in with new money who hasn't been there for the journey and is saying, cool, I don't care that you put in 10 years to this company, like the price is this.
Mm-hmm.
And that sucks, like it just sucks. But I think unfortunately that's just sort of the circle of life of building a company. And a lot of the people who make a bunch of money on startups, it's just as much timing as it is
Timing's everything.
Yeah.
The last question I always finish with is a question about networking. How important is your network? And to somebody coming new into building a company, give them some advice while building a network.
My network is everything. Like obviously I have a sort of funny perspective on this because my like core occupation is writing a newsletter to lots of people. I think, and again, this will seem self-serving, but like, especially if I was an early career person, I would find a group of people who are invested in your success and write them on a regular basis. And this is the same thing I tell entrepreneurs too, of like, you should be writing an investor update every month.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not necessarily for like every piece of content has to be like, the great American novel. It's just like showing people that you're going to do what you say you're going to do. Right. So like, if you're writing every month and you're like, these are my North Star goals, this is the thing for next month that we're going to do, and these are the things we said we were going to do last month, and here's what we accomplished. Like, that shows your ability to function as a professional in a way that is almost impossible to get in any other way other than like working directly for a person. So I think you don't have to have like a informed opinion on specific facets of the market, but like find something to write about, write it to 5 people,
Mm-hmm.
and like, add people as makes sense. It'll shape your own thinking about the market, and it'll show people that you're a thoughtful person just trying to like grow in the world. So again, funny advice coming from not sort of uh, not surprising advice coming from a newsletter writer, but I do think there's a lot of value to that.
That's how
And
I
I would
approach it.
advise,
Every month I
yeah,
send a letter out that comes out. I'm not as consistent to the day, but it comes out within the first week of each month, every month. And I would be amazed with, people that passed early on that are now like re-engaged, and we're pretty
yeah,
far down the pipeline for raising capital at this point, but the amount of people that, were like, oh no, this isn't for us, or, that have now circled back and are probably going to make an investment, that
that's awesome.
just buy that newsletter. And every time I talk to an investor, I just ask them like, hey, can I add you to our newsletter or our monthly updates? And, ultimately they all want to know if you're making an impact and you're doing something cool, they want to follow along. It's just, there's different metrics that they need to follow. And it is what it is. So, Matt, I appreciate you jumping on the show. If somebody wanted to reach out or get a hold of you, what's the best way to do it?
I etch.club is my newsletter. If you respond to the newsletter, it goes directly to my inbox. You can find me on LinkedIn, Matt Tower, and on Twitter, MD Tower 14. But subscribe. Literally, every response goes directly to my inbox. So that's the easiest way to get a hold of me.
Okay, well, I appreciate it, Matt. Thank you so much for joining us on the show, and I look forward to having you on again one day.
Yeah, I appreciate it. This was fun.
Thank you. Talk soon.